And nowhere do you see this more than with the space race. Now, America wins the space race in that we're the first people, we're the only people to put a manned mission on the moon, to have a man walk on the moon. And that was a Soviet goal. They give up on it when we do it first. But the Soviets are in the lead on everything else. They're the first people to put a satellite in orbit, the first people to put a human being in orbit, the first people to put a space station in orbit. They're actually the first people to land something on the moon, an unmanned mission to it. They're excellent at science. They're excellent at rocketry. When they set their mind to something, they can get results. And this even applies to things like catching up growth. The Soviet economy grows by these huge leaps and bounds in the 30s, 40s, 50s. Now, they do it because they essentially leave nothing to consumption. It would not be considered efficient, just like how I told you slavery is not economically efficient. Well, saving everything to build more factories is not efficient if people don't want that many factories. People suffer from not being able to consume the goods that they would like to consume. But it's like, yeah, you can grow quicker. You can industrialize quicker if you apply all of your efforts to industrialization. What they couldn't do was they couldn't grow beyond that. Schumpeterian growth, growth that doesn't end, growth that continues forever, they were completely inept at because their bureaucratic system of management had no use for things like entrepreneurs. It had no use for variety. It had no use for competing brands. If you found a better way to make a product, then that would endanger potentially the jobs or the status of all of the bureaucrats who already make that product. Now, in a market economy, you would be able to just run them out of business. But in the Soviet system, there is no real economic decision making. Everything is political. Everything is a matter of connections and lobbying ability, and whoever currently has the ear of the big dictator. And so established interests could shut down any sort of change that threatened their own power base. In the Soviet world, you get an appliance, you have one choice of appliance, you have one brand of each type of food, you have one of everything, and there's one way that we make things, and that's it. It's not a world that lends itself to choice or variety. And science itself could often become politicized. An entire line of scientific inquiry could be shut down because it was not politically correct. Now, I don't use that word in the sense that, like, a boomer con says that, something is, oh, that's politically correct, libtards. That word politically correct originally comes out of Nazi Germany, and it referred to teachings that met with the party orthodoxy. It then gets applied to totalitarian societies in general. That which is politically correct is that which agrees with the ruling class. And there were times when the dictator would disagree with some scientific belief just out of their own stubbornness or out of some belief that it could, in some metaphorical way, undermine communism. And so they would just ban it outright. There's the infamous story of the Catholic Church banning Galileo, arresting Galileo for disagreeing. And it's a bit of a myth because the real reason why Galileo was arrested was because he mocked the Pope in his criticism. It wasn't that they didn't like his teaching; it was that they didn't like the way he went about, popping his mouth off. In the Soviet Union, you actually do get that kind of, oh, your science is evil. It disagrees with the eternal truth of Marxism. And in particular, there's a very infamous case with what was called Lysenkoism. So, way back in the day, Gregor Mendel invents genetics, right? He's the first guy, he's playing around with his pea plants, comes up with this sort of theory of heredity. They don't know about DNA yet, they don't know how it works, but they just know that there is such a thing as heredity, and you can predict the attributes of offspring. And your mainstream genetics worked on this assumption that the inheritance happens at the moment of conception or reproduction. And when you combine genetics with Darwinian evolution, that's also emerging in the same time frame, you get this explanation that the genetic attributes of an organism are encoded in it at the moment of its creation, and a species changes through breeding that selects for certain traits. But there was a rival to Darwin named Lamarck. And Lamarck, I might be mispronouncing his name, to be honest, but Lamarck, he believed that it was not the traits at the moment of birth that cause an organism's offspring to have certain traits. Rather, it's the traits at the moment of like conception. And Lamarck is doing these experiments where, if his theory is correct, you should be able to do things like cut the tails off of rats, and their offspring should have a shorter tail because the parent has a shorter tail when the rat is conceived. You get the difference? Well, this ends up coming back in the Soviet Union, right? This is not true. It's not correct. In the end, Lamarck didn't turn out to be completely wrong because now there's a field called epigenetics that there actually are ways that your DNA can change throughout the course of your life. But Lamarck, he's saying that like everything is epigenetic, not just some things. Well, this ends up fusing with Marxism because even though Darwin is not himself a social Darwinist, Darwin actually hates those kinds of people. The sort that want to leave the poor to starve because they're inferior. But there's a lot of idiots in the world that interpret that, right? They look at the cold, uncaring world of nature and they say, this is how human society ought to operate. Stripped out of all of its moral content, even of the moral content that someone like Adam Smith, still felt had to be included, that the rules have to steer you towards right behavior. Well, for the social Darwinists, it's just every man for himself because it's survival of the fittest. And the Marxists, they hate this idea, right? Because it promotes unrestricted capitalism. It promotes inequality. It goes against everything their ideology stands for. So, what does Joseph Stalin do? Does he promote a lot of healthy discussion? Does he promote research to prove why Lysenkoism is right? Trofim Lysenko is the disciple of Lamarck. He's the Soviet biologist that brings this stuff back. Do they prove the value of Lysenkoism on its own merits? No. They just ban regular genetics. If you're teaching genetics and it's not Lysenkoist genetics, you go to the gulag. You get shot. He does this. He even does it to one of his own friends who refused to, bend to the new rules, who refused to agree with something he did not believe in, felt that it contradicted his own interpretation of reality. Okay, so it's a bunch of boring nerd crap. How's this relevant? Well, it's relevant because modern agriculture relies a lot on genetics. You want to breed a good plant. You want to create a genetically modified organism, maybe. We need to get crop yields up. And Russia has a big problem. Their crop yields are always low. They're always low because they collectivize the farm so that the peasants have no incentive to put any work in. And then they subject everything to this centralized planning, we're going to set the prices so that there's always shortages of everything. The Russians can barely feed themselves, despite the fact that, again, like with Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, be one of the biggest agricultural producers on earth. So they need a way to get the crop yields up. And they can't do it. Because they're doing things like, oh, if we water the plant and make a really big pumpkin, and then we take seeds from it, we'll get an even bigger pumpkin. And that's not how the genetics works. And it causes starvation. People die of famine because this jerk off gets, complete free reign to impose his own scientific theories on everyone. Perhaps you see some parallels to the modern day situation in the West. There was a philosopher of science that is a field. It's a really good field. I'm not a philosophy guy, other than like my Smith, my economics philosophy, but I like philosophy of science. And Polanyi, I taught you about spontaneous order with Hayek. Hayek's the guy that starts using it to talk about economics, but Polanyi's the man that creates the term. He uses it slightly differently, but it's the same idea that nature makes its own way. Nature makes its own order. This might sound a little like social Darwinism, but there is a difference. The social Darwinist guys are assholes. They don't care about the moral outcome of it. The fact that it's nature is itself the reason for doing it. Well, Polanyi saw science as being a spontaneous order because science is driven by consensus, but in scientific inquiry, you don't force people to agree with you. Everyone has to argue off of their own facts, and so you get information being traded back and forth. You get people sending signals in the forms of expressing approval or disapproval of an idea. You get a consensus and interpretation of reality that emerges naturally out of a culture's willingness to act upon ideas. Marx wanted to create scientific socialism, and Polanyi, writing in the middle of the Cold War, argues not only is there nothing scientific about that, but your science is going to break. It's not going to work. The communists want to run everything through this very bureaucratic approach. We're going to have the academy, and the academy is going to decide what is true, and the academy is going to conduct all the research, rah 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 rah. And Polanyi looks around at the actual scientists he knows. He sees what a bunch of losers they are. Like, trust me, academics are very petty people. They have what's called the academic feud. It's like a nerd fight, but even more pathetic. They, there are so many different horror stories from the history of science with people basically just trying to bully their rivals out of the profession. And Polanyi's like, yeah, You want to give these people 100% control over who even gets to talk. You're not going to get good science. People are going to use a bludgeon. They're going to use the force of the state to decide what's true and what isn't. And when that doesn't match up with reality, you are going to cause suffering. The Chinese would have their own horror stories. I'm trying to finish this up so I don't like go way too over on time. But you should look up the four evils. Yeah, the four evils or the four pests in Maoist China. In China, they very infamous. They decide to have a big centralized campaign to kill off four pests that were plaguing the public: rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows. And some ecologists say, hey, Chairman Mao, if you kill off the sparrows, the sparrows eat things like locusts. Yeah, the sparrows, they eat our crops, but they also eat the locusts that eat our crops. And we're just a little worried that if you exterminate sparrows, they might devour the crop. And Chairman Mao says, to the gulag with. Chairman Mao did not brook any disagreement from anyone. Anybody who criticizes the Four Pests campaign gets unpersoned, right? You're thrown in jail, you're executed, you're not going to be working for the government. Well, guess who was right? Yeah, that would be your Chinese equivalent of Lysenkoism.